righty, we will get started since Avery is here. Again, I'm Derek Fong. I am our host for the quarter on this seminar series on data-driven wildfire research, where we hope to really start a dialogue with wildfire researchers, data scientists, and people of many disciplines of interest in this critical problem of significance to both California, the West, as well as the world. I am pleased that we have Avery Hill here speaking with us today about zombie forests, which is a really cool graphic, if you caught that in the advertisement. He received his Bachelor of Science from Cornell University, where he studied both biology and botany. Avery is a PhD student in Chris Field's lab. His academic interests include vegetation, biogeography, community ecology, and environmental ethics. One of his current projects pertains to changes in North American vegetation distribution in response to shifts in wildfire regimes, climate, and land use. And so today he's going to present some work he's been doing on zombie forests, fire risk of the standing dead in the Sierra Nevada. So we hope to hear from him and hope to have an active discussion following his presentation. Take it away, Avery.
Great, thank you, Derek. That is my first introduction, so and that was a great one, so thank you, Derek. Today, does everything look like it's working all right? Cool. All right. Hi. For those who don't know me, I'm Avery Hill. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in the biology department. Like Derek said, I'm a botanist and biogeographer, and I'm really interested in the drivers, impacts, and implications of species range shifts. Today, I'm going to talk about a project that Chris, Connor Nolan, Kyle Heems, Trevor Cambrone, and I have been working on that's relatively new and just starting to yield some results worth talking about. But it's at like a good stage for feedback, so I'd love to hear all your thoughts. We've been studying vegetation disequilibrium, this phenomenon where the strong relationship between the climate and vegetation of a locality is eroded due to climate change and its potential impact on fire risk in California. I'll start by briefly reviewing some basics of plant biogeography. In case you didn't know, this is what a crass oversimplification of the drivers of plant distributions look like. But the takeaway here is that different drivers affect plant species range limits at different scales. From the subcontinental to a pretty local scale, climate variables like annual precipitation and average summer temperatures strongly influence what plant species occur in a given area. At the scale of California, climate best explains the vegetation geography. And you can see on the left that conifers, mapped here in green, are kind of relegated to the cooler and wetter coastal and montane regions of California, while the driest areas of California, kind of in white here, are occupied by grasses, scrubland, desert vegetation, things like that. So knowing, as we do, that climate is a strong determinant of what plants grow where, we expect and know that in some cases that as the climate changes, plant distributions must shift in order to stay within the climate regime that they're adapted to. Global meta-analysis from 2011 found that over the last century, plants have been shifting upward in elevation by about 15 meters per decade. And another study in the French Alps found that although plant populations were shifting around 30 meters per decade towards higher elevation, the actual rate of climate change, like the movement of the temperature isotherm upslope, was about 75 meters per decade, nearly 3 times the rate at which the average plant range was shifting. Only about 25% of plant species kept up in this study. And this trend is not unique to the Alps. It's just one good example of it, but plant biogeographers think that most plants around the world will not keep pace with climate change over the next decades to centuries. Svenning and Sandel in 2013 wrote a paper that really fleshes this phenomenon out in their description of something called vegetation disequilibrium, which is a state of vegetation that occurs when the vegetation of a locality is not growing in the climate to which it is adapted. So this is how I kind of like to describe vegetation disequilibrium. Imagine we have 2 plant populations, we'll call these pines and oaks, distributed along some climatic gradient that climate change affects, like max temperature in a montane area. Each of these populations have their own unique suite of climate variables that they're best adapted to. As I'm showing it now, these plants are in vegetation equilibrium, where they're growing in the climate to which they're adapted. When the climate changes and the max temperature isotherm moves upslope faster than the plant populations can, we end up with a region pine forest here that occupies the climatic niche of the oak trees. We call this subset of vegetation, we call this subset of vegetation disequilibrium that specifically refers to forests, zombie forests. They're the standing dead. They'll die and be replaced by oak trees or some downslope vegetation eventually. But because of ecosystem engineering or simply the durability of mature trees, these forests may not transition for a long time. We don't really know what these transitions will look like and how long they will take, but evidence is starting to accumulate that disturbances in ecosystems can facilitate transitions that are driven by climate change. We think that in California, wildfire might be this disturbance that clears out zombie forests and facilitates vegetation transitions. So back to what we know. We know that the climate is changing here in California. CalAdapt has a really cool tool where you upload a shapefile of a particular area and it returns the observed and modeled climate shifts for that region. I put in a shapefile of the Sierra Nevada and just kind of crudely derived an increase in mean annual temperature in this area by about like 1.2 degrees Celsius since the 1950s. So the climate's changing. And as we expect, we've observed corresponding vegetation shifts in California, both demographically and geographically. A study in 2015 found that as climate water deficit has increased across California, the density of large trees has decreased. Geographic shifts have been documented as well. In the Santa Rosa Mountains of Southern California, Kelly and Goulden found that 10 dominant species along an elevational gradient shifted upward around 65 meters since the 1970s, losing individuals at lower elevational limits and kind of gaining ground at upper limits. This trend yields a characteristic kind of lean upslope that we see with a lot of montane populations in response to climate change. So we're confident that vegetation disequilibrium exists and that the climate and vegetation are changing here in California. What we don't know or haven't really seen a spatially explicit description of is whether vegetation disequilibrium, particularly zombie forests, exist here in California. And furthermore, we really have no idea what the implications of these forests are or might be for not only California ecosystems, but also land management and public health. So our driving questions, are there zombie forests in California? Can we map them? Can we find them? Are these areas more prone to wildfire? We think that as these forests are on their way out, they may be, individuals may be dying and they may be at particular risk for wildfire. Is it possible to kind of quantify zombie forests and their potential risk of wildfire and use these in risk models? And then more broadly, how can we incorporate, if zombie forests are more at risk of wildfire, or if they do exist, how can we incorporate this knowledge into long-term preventative fire management? What I'll be talking about today, and pretty much where we're at with this project so far, is really trying to figure out whether zombie forests exist in California and where they might be. We figured that the best place to start looking for zombie forests would be in the lower elevational limit of conifer forests in the Sierra Nevada. Conifers in the Sierra Nevada, like ponderosa pine, Douglas firs, sugar pines, require higher precipitation and lower mean annual temperature than most other non-coastal California vegetation. Because of this, we think that these forests may be at particular risk in a warming and drying climate. Chaparral and mixed hardwood forests typically fall below these conifer forests, and this edge between conifers and oaks and chaparral is generally below about 1,500 meters. We found some encouraging preliminary evidence that affirmed we were probably looking in the right place. Between the 1930s and 2010s, the elevational profile of conifers in the Sierra Nevada exhibited that characteristic kind of upslope lean, suggesting that these forests have been responding to climate change over the last century by colonizing new areas at higher elevations and losing individuals at lower elevations. We're very interested in this area in particular, near the lower range limit of conifers in the Sierras. Below about 1,500 meters, where it looks like conifers have been dying off and losing area. Zombie forests, this isn't exactly evidence of zombie forests, but zombie forests might exist in this area if the rate at which conifers have been dying off is slower than the rate at which the climate has been changing. So we thought we'd start by looking kind of below 1,500 meters in the Sierra Nevada. So the general plan, We start by characterizing the climatic niche which is the suite of climate features that determine conifer distributions in the Sierras, by building a habitat suitability model. Because the climate's changed, we try to use the oldest climate and vegetation occurrence data we can to characterize a relationship between conifers and the climate, because the vegetation will be closer to equilibrium with the climate the further back we can go. We use this habitat suitability model we train on historic data to estimate where we would expect conifers to grow today, given that conifers have been able to keep pace exactly with climate change and are in equilibrium with the climate. So that's the expected distribution of conifers. And then we compare where we expect conifers to occur today based on the climate to where we actually find conifers. And zombie forests are those, we think zombie forests are those areas where we find conifers today, but where we wouldn't expect them to occur based on the climate. The vegetation data we use, there's a really, really helpful survey performed by this Weisslander group in the 1930s, where they're mostly doing it for timber for logging information, but they tried to produce as continuous of vegetation maps as possible for most of California. And they mapped vegetation types instead of individual species. And they went out there with telescopes and ground truth a lot of these areas and produced maps. These were recently digitized at Davis and Berkeley. And we've been using this data as our historic kind of baseline. The contemporary data we use uses the same vegetation type maps or type characterization, but it's mostly satellite derived and produced by the US Forest Service CalVeg program. And that's about 30 meters resolution. The climate data we use in the habitat suitability model, we source from PRISM. It starts at about 4 kilometer resolution, but we downscale it to 1 kilometer. From max and min monthly temperatures and precipitation, we produce 19 biologically relevant climatic variables like mean temperature of the warmest month and mean diurnal range for both historical time periods where our historical occurrence data is from, and from current time periods. We just averaged between 1995 and 2015. We built habitat suitability models using 19 different algorithms and really just chose the one that produced the best accuracy metrics. That ended up being a generalized additive model, which had the highest AUC and TSS scores, which are common statistics and species distribution modeling. We were able to feed in around 17,000 presence points and 7,000 absence points of where we find conifers and where we don't find conifers across the Sierras. And from these 19 biologically relevant climate variables, we reduced this set to the least collinear set of 6, which range from precipitation seasonality to mean precipitation of the coldest quarter. So this is a map here of our conifer habitat suitability model mapped back onto the 1930s climate data with which it was trained to orient. You can see the vertex of California and Nevada here, where Lake Tahoe is. A visual inspection shows that the observed conifer distribution of the 1930s, kind of on the right overlaid, matches the areas of high habitat suitability that are in yellow. Some common accuracy metrics using species distribution modeling like AUC and TSS suggest that we've got a decent conifer habitat suitability model. And so yeah, this is trained on the 1930s data. When we look at what the most important climatic variables that determine the conifer distribution, we find that it's the mean temperature of the wettest quarter, so pretty much mean winter temperature here in the Sierras, and then the precipitation of, the winter temperature and precipitation controls conifer distribution. And you can see that above 5 degrees Celsius, the habitat suitability for conifers drops pretty significantly, and below 500 or so millimeters of precipitation during the winter, conifer habitat suitability drops. So we really are finding, we think this is good evidence that we're finding this edge of conifer distribution that's, you know, kind of limited by being too hot and too dry. So that was nice to see. Now, when we take this habitat suitability model and feed it contemporary climate data from the last few decades, and we produce a map of where we expect conifers to be growing today. Again, this area about is Tahoe region. I'll put this in more geographic context in a minute. But we end up with something like this. We ended up adding a threshold of about 0.7, which is the habitat suitability metric, where we say above 0.7, we really expect to find conifers here, and below 0.7, we don't think this is reasonable habitat for conifers to occur. So we can take this map of where we expect conifers to occur and compare it to, well, we can take this map of where we expect conifers to occur today and subtract from it where we thought conifers should be occurring in the 1930s. And we find all the areas in the Sierras where the habitat suitability has decreased over the last century. So everywhere in red here are regions of forest where it used to support conifers, but no longer today. In blue, or this purple here, we have areas where habitat suitability has actually increased over the last century. And it does appear that kind of where we'd expect, along this kind of like lower elevational western slope in the Sierras, we do see a decrease in habitat suitability. And you have to believe me, but on this axis here in the Sierras, this is the higher elevational area, and we do see a moderate gain in habitat suitability, kind of upslope, which is something we'd expect. We're still trying to figure out what's happening in the southern Sierras, where it looks like habitat suitability has increased in a lot of areas, but we're still teasing that apart. But when we take that map of habitat suitability change and compare it to where we actually find conifers today, we end up with this map of what we think are zombie forests. So in gray here, we have current conifer distribution that is in equilibrium with the climate. But in red are all the areas where the habitat suitability has decreased over the last century, such that we no longer think these areas can support or should support conifers. And then in this kind of gold color, which is only in kind of small little splotches, are areas that over the last century have already transitioned from conifers to something else. And this is usually like mixed hardwood or chaparral vegetation. So let me zoom in a little bit on this. We really see a lot of zombie forests along this lower elevational limit in the northwestern Sierras. If we zoom in just a little bit, you get kind of a better map. And we can see that there is a pretty sizable amount of zombie forest. It's about 2,000 square kilometers in the Sierra Nevada, which is about, I ran some math this morning, it's about 18% of all conifer forest in the Sierra Nevada. And you can see it really does hug that kind of lower elevational extent of conifer distributions in the Sierras. And although anecdotal, it's worth noting that places like Paradise, California are adjacent to, which suffered from a huge fire just a few years ago, is pretty adjacent to large swaths of conifer forests, or of zombie forests. So our takeaways, we think there are zombie forests in California. We've been able to spatially make a spatially explicit map of a reasonable area that we think conifers shouldn't really be, but are. And it's a non-trivial fraction of conifer forests. Like I said, about 18% of the area. The work we're planning on doing, well, we think we found zombie forests in California, but what we really want to figure out is whether these areas correspond to greater risk of wildfire, or some kind of dimension of maybe catastrophic wildfire or burn area, or ignition risk. We're not really sure yet. And then If so, we'd like to know, how, if it's possible to integrate these with wildfire risk models and how to incorporate this knowledge into longer-term fire management. Further work also includes, we recently started talking to people at iNaturalist, and what we'd really love to do is kind of get a ground truthing of zombie forests and be able to say, in these particular areas where we expect conifers to not recover after a fire, and the area to transition to some other type of vegetation, what do we really see on the ground? Are these areas not really coming back? And is it possible to have citizen scientists go out and find that, these zombie forests are not recovering? It would be amazing to be able to identify indicator species of zombie forests where perhaps some Mariposa lily, when it's growing underneath an incense cedar, we know that the Mariposa lily was able to keep pace with climate change, but the incense cedar has not. And if you find some particular plant in the shade of another tree, this area, it might be kind of the harbinger of death for a particular forest. That would be great to understand more about. And generally, I'm really fascinated with, and I think we all are, with this idea of kind of getting people involved in thinking about vegetation transitions as the climate changes, and get people more involved with helping out, helping think about this stuff. So the implications of this work, well, if our future work shows that these areas are particularly at risk for catastrophic wildfire, there may be many implications for long-term fire management, including a prioritization of thinning, prescribed burning, or otherwise facilitating transitions to more stable vegetation in these areas. Even if we find that these areas aren't at particular risk for catastrophic wildfire, we're reasonably certain that these areas will be less likely to return to the prior vegetation after wildfire, which carries conservation and carbon sequestration concerns. If conifer forests are carrying a lot more carbon than chaparral, then it's worth knowing, if these areas burn, we're going to lose a lot of long-term carbon storage. And more generally, the knowledge that there are vast forests in California that kind of are on their way out due to climate change can be used to establish conservation priorities. It might be more useful to protect the habitat of a non-zombie forest than it would be to protect a forest that will inevitably transition to something like chaparral in the near future. Thanks to my collaborators, Kyle, Connor, Chris, and Trevor, and the field lab for all their feedback on this. And I'm open for questions.
Thanks for a great talk, Avery. Great stuff. Yeah, I'll open up the floor to questions. You can either speak up or raise your hand. We got a pretty small group, so I think people can chime in politely. Kelly, you're raising your hand really politely and you're screaming. Go ahead, Kelly. Why don't you go first?
Okay, cool. Hi, good to see all of you. Avery, that's awesome work that you're doing. It's super interesting. I had a question about kind of what, if there are areas along the southern boundary that might tell us something about kind of what comes in as a replacement. So I'm wondering, like you've been saying all conifers kind of can't exist within this area, but are there examples of some conifers that tend to be in that more, arid, hot environment? And do you see examples or, has anybody looked at examples of places at the southern edge where other replacements might be coming in?
Mm-hmm. We haven't, and this is something we intend to do, is really get into kind of what particular species are being extirpated and what species are moving in. My understanding is that Jeffrey pines are probably also the pinyon pines are those conifers in the Sierras that are really kind of drought tolerant. Can be, and probably less likely to be extirpated than something like Douglas firs. We haven't really looked at what's happening in the southern Sierras yet, but I think you're right that might be kind of the area to really hone in on and look for what's being extirpated and what's able to kind of persist throughout and moving in. And also, I'm not sure if Connor's on the call, but Chris, if you have anything to add, or if anyone else wants to chime in on this work, please.
I may just say that my expectation is that mostly we're going to see transitions from gymnosperms to angiosperms at this zombie forest zone.
Great. Other questions? You can either speak up or do the polite raise your hand on participant list or whatever you want. Bruce, you're off mic, so you must be.
Yeah. So I, you know, obviously I'm thinking 5 steps ahead, and that's a little unfair. I'm kind of interested in how this will ultimately deal with wildfire management. So I guess the relevant way to say this is, you know, what do we need to know to put it into a policy eventually? And it seems very promising. So I agree with everybody. It's as science, it's great, and as a potential useful tool for policy, it's great. But there's some questions, obviously. So let me throw 2 that a policymaker might ask you. One is the fact that it's in transition. How long do you have before it becomes a dangerous piece of wood? Okay. In other words, how many years do you have to be into a changing temperature before it actually starts to die and become highly problematic? And then secondly, if we were to, the policymaker later on might say, well, okay, if we've identified an area that's in transition and seemingly is going to be more dangerous, then we might want to take certain steps before the danger gets too great. And that could be, say, mechanical thinning. And so then the question I have for you is, if you go, what we're hearing from a lot of the CAL FIRE people and Marin, when we're talking to them, is how shocked they are that when they try to do mechanical thinning or prescriptive burns, they run into opposition from environmental groups. So in anticipation that that might happen, do zombie forests have zombie wildlife? I mean, does the wild, will people say, no, you can't do that because there still are certain kinds of birds or certain kinds of wildlife that are staying with the zombie forest? And will that become a problem if you wanted to, say, mechanically thin that area? Now, I don't know that you have answers to that, but I do think that those are the kinds of considerations that somebody's going to raise if we try to take this information and turn it into useful wildfire management policy.
Yeah, thank you for the good questions. I think in terms of how long it takes for these to transition and what we think the relative risk of these areas are, at this point we really have no idea.
Yeah, I know.
We would like to know. What we can do is we do have kind of we do know the distance, or like how outside of kind of climate equilibrium each of these areas are. We can quantify, these areas, these particular forests are really far from where they belong and are probably more at risk. So I guess we have relative metrics, but it's hard to say, well, as of yet, it's hard to say these areas are going to transition in 10 years. We can start, and what we're starting to look at is kind of the areas that have already because we know the areas that have already transitioned since the 1930s, from conifers to chaparral or whatever else. And something we're planning on doing is looking at, is there something particular about these areas that have already transitioned, and what are, how far away from kind of the habitat suitability are these areas that have caused or like led to this transition.
So Avery, could I just follow up on that? So would you have to have people go in there, citizen scientists go in there and ascertain whether, trees were dying? Or is there a way that you can do that aerially and figure that out so that you could get some proportion of seemingly dead, completely dead, still going well? Is there any way that you can do that other than sending lots of people in there with, to do citizen? Not that that's a bad thing to do, but I'm just wondering if there's any kind of big data way to figure that out.
I think there probably is. We haven't really looked into it too much. What what I don't have a good grasp on is how tractable that is, and I think what we've been thinking about using a naturalist for is to see if there are, to look at seedlings kind of, and to look at like what is regenerating from these areas, and I'm not sure if that's tractable from like a remote sensing perspective, but certainly to look at areas that are kind of dying and at risk in areas that we think are about to transition that could be useful. We haven't really looked into
Yeah. And then the wildlife question, I think you were about to
Yeah.
tell me something about that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I was going to agree that it's really interesting, and I'm not really entirely sure. But my impression is that being able to, explicitly map zombie forests and say these areas are on their way out, kind of no matter what. At this point, the climate has changed, and they're going to transition, but we don't know when. I think kind of supports more interventionist approaches in these areas, where we're able to say, it's already on its way up, so it makes it more permissible to do thinning and all these things. But it's a hard question, but I think relatively it's easier to say, well,
Yeah, but what I'm getting at is you could have species disequilibrium.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Right? You could have species that are somehow hanging on, even though the trees you wouldn't want to clear out. And that's where the fire department or the CAL FIRE people run into trouble, is that, the groups that say, well, wait a minute, you can't do that. Now, that's not to say it can't be overcome, but it was just, that was what I was really getting at, is kind of like a species disequilibrium on top of your tree situation.
And I think you're totally right. And I think species are all responding to climate change at very different rates.
Yeah.
My just off the cuff impression is that I would imagine that animals are moving a bit faster than trees. So my thought is that, if there is kind of an elevational shift of suitable habitat moving upslope, and the trees are able to kind of move upslope, the animals will be able to kind of follow a bit better than the lower elevational trees will. But certainly there are in these zombie forest areas, there's going to be plenty of species, animals, and whatever else that have conservation value or otherwise that are going to be still around probably for a while. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Other questions? Go ahead, Krishna.
Thanks, Avery, for your talk. So I have a question related to your characterization of the zombie forests. You just calculated it using the generalized additive model, and it shows that these 18% of the landscape should not have been conifer forest, but it is now. So your conclusion was that in the future, they may transition out, like these conifer forests may not exist anymore. But then is it possible that somehow these places are the ones which acclimated to the new climate, and that's why that they exist now, and they will continue to exist because of prolonged acclimation? I think there is some evidence that plant traits have acclimated to drought at least. So why not for the new climate too?
That's a great question. I think it is a bit of an oversimplification to not really be thinking about acclimation or even adaptation. My impression is that kind of the rate and the kind of scale at which this is occurring, acclimation is not going to be able to account for a lot of these shifts. I think that when looking at these zombie forest maps that we've produced are probably a bit of an overestimation when considering acclimation. But I think that, that's not going to be able to account for, all the forests. And I think that since there have been transitions, we are seeing transitions. I think that not all these areas are going to acclimate. Yeah, I don't know, Chris, do you have anything, or Connor, do you have anything to weigh in on that? So I think that is an important point.
Connor, were you going to comment? And I'll just say two quick things. One, it's important to remember these are the same individual trees that were there in the old climate. And so the question is there some reason that the habitat distribution, that the climate species relationship from the 30s is altered as a result of climate changes in the last 30 years or so? It's not impossible, but it's kind of hard to see where that would happen at the scale of individual organism characteristics. It could be that a lot of the mechanism by which ecosystems respond is more at the spacing of individuals and the size of individuals. And certainly, you look at the distribution of ponderosa pine, and there's little widely spaced trees at the dry end and big close together ones in the middle and little closely spaced ones at the upper elevation end. And so patterns like that are probably occurring in these areas that have become less suitable over the decades.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chris. Other questions? I guess I'll chime in with one so people can build. Devin, I'll get you next. Following up, I guess, on Bruce's question, I'm always required to rein this in to think about data. So first, a clarification question. Did you say that, so you were looking basically at 1930 versus 2010 data? Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is there data available before 2010? And of course, there is, I assume, with big data and satellite technology, more data that has come in the last 11 years. Would that allow us to understand a little bit more of the trend and migration patterns, and give us some more predictive ability to think about some of the bigger questions that you raised on your slide of like, what are the timescales we're talking about?
Great question, Doug. Thanks. So this is something we're also thinking about, and we have an abundance of and kind of continuous conifer distribution data from the 1930s, and we have an abundance of the entire Sierras for the 2010s. So that's kind of the two time points at which we've really been looking. But since we've kind of done that analysis, we've been trying to fill in kind of what's been happening between these areas. One thing we're doing is the PRISM climate product that we've been using is from the 1900s all the way through now, and we're looking at different kind of time slices at how the zombie forest has, we would expect it to have like changed or grown over the last century. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is that we have an undergrad working with us that is looking at aerial photography of in pretty much mid-century, and what we're trying to do is, although it's not, it doesn't cover a huge range, but what we're doing with that is using it to kind of validate some of these areas and see, we think, this area is zombie forest. Let's see what it looked like in the 70s and see if it was kind of like on the way or transitioning. So in terms of big data, I think the biggest data we have is now and a lot of this from the 1930s, and we're really just kind of piecing together the parts in between. But I think going into the future, in terms of thinking about the data-driven side of this project, other than that which has been obvious is kind of using citizen science data, and really there's a ton of really interesting questions on how to kind of harness all this information and really use it in a meaningful way. And that's kind of what we're going to start doing at an even smaller kind of temporal resolution, like since citizen science has been around, like the last decade or two.
That's fantastic. Yeah, because I was really I found it very profound that you were able to sort of at least anecdotally look at paradise, right, from 2010, and then see that happens. I guess sort of sad thing is, right, we get more fires, you'll have more data of that type to see if there's any correlations and patterns. Devon, you were next.
Oh yeah, I was curious about if you're thinking of looking at developed areas versus not developed areas, so like maybe public lands versus private lands or something like that, because I would think like if there's some other reason that there might be habitat degradation, maybe the trends would be much higher than in an area that was mostly left alone for like a really long time, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's a really, thanks, Evan. That's a really interesting part of this that we've been looking at. I haven't been working on this too much myself. One of our collaborators, Connor and Kyle, were working on this quite a bit, and we're still trying to figure out exactly how different land use patterns have kind of corresponded with vegetation transitions in these areas. Chris or Connor, unless you remember, I don't think there's been anything too definitive in this realm, but we relatively recently have only produced like this zombie forest map, and now the work is going to be figuring out what's there, who owns this land, what are some of the land use practices, and if they correspond to any particular trends. Yeah, thanks, Devin.
Other questions? No, please.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the, I guess it was a 0.7 habitat suitability index tipping point.
Yeah.
And if you could describe sort of in words what that really represents. Is it based on the two main parameters, or did you do a sensitivity analysis? Just sort of give us a better feel for
Cool.
what that tipping point represents.
Cool, thank you, Nona. Yeah, we're still kind of figuring out what this tipping point, the best one might be. I think, I mean, it's going to be hard to pick one number, because no one number is going to be correct. But what that threshold is it's the threshold at which everything below it has the least. Everything below it, when we say that everything below 0.7 is a conifer absence, when we compare it to actual conifer distribution data, it has the most true absences, and everything above 0.7, when we compare it to actual conifer occurrences, is where we have the most like true presences. I mean, we've been playing with ranges from about 0.5 to 0.7, and it looks like it doesn't really affect our results that much. It's not. It appears that in these zombie forest areas, this kind of threshold of habitat suitability doesn't matter too much, because the transitions have been so large over the last century. So if the transitions are going from they're dropping like habitat suitability by a magnitude of like 0.4 or something. So if that's the case, if it's going from 0.9 habitat suitability to 0.5, then any threshold from 0.5 to 0.7 is going to register that as like a zombie forest. And we found that most of these transitions are really across like a pretty wide gulf in habitat suitability. So the exact threshold hasn't been too important. Does that contextualize it a bit? Cool. Thanks, Donna.
Any other questions? All righty, we're actually done a little early. Thank you very much for a very stimulating talk, Avery. This looks like amazing stuff. And thank you for everyone attending today. Just want to announce that next week, Krishna will be up. He's going to talk about data-driven vegetation moisture as a tool for wildfire mapping. So I think you can see, I think Chris set the stage well, and Avery's followed up with zombie forest. So we've got connections here. That wasn't really the plan. We just booked the calendar, but we got some nice continuity between our talks. So keep inviting your cohorts and colleagues to join us in this forum. And I'm going to work with Chris Menzel on how to figure out how to put these recordings online as well. But please have people attend live. I think the benefit is having these dialogues after the presenter has gone. So thanks again for everyone's attention. Thanks again to Avery. And we look forward to seeing you next week. And Krishna, who I know will give us a great talk. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.